Well, thank you all for being here. This is so special for me as an author, but also as a member of this community. I'm just thrilled to be here in the Northshire. It's one of the reasons that my wife Vicki and I moved here and have found such a wonderful home here, is that we have a beautiful bookstore like this. And it's also because the Northshire is really where a lot of this book was written. And I don't know how many of you are writers, but it's a pretty solitary business, and there are times when you just have to stop looking at that same computer screen and those same walls. And the cafe downstairs is just one of my favorite places to sit and write. So I couldn't be happier to be here to share a passion for Mars with you. Eric mentioned Ray Bradbury, and I think that he is a fine place to start. Ray Bradbury, who was born in 1920, is to me the single best interpreter of the passion for space exploration and why space exploration is important to us as human beings. And in fact, on the very first page of the book, I tell a story in which Ray, at the age of 12 years old in Waukegan, Illinois, would on a Saturday night be propelled down the streets of Waukegan on roller skates, but pulled by his little dog, Pete, in a sort of a little miniature dog sled. And he would head into town, and he would pick up an ice cream cone and the Sunday Funnies. And then he would head back to his house and read the Sunday Funnies en route with the ice cream cone in the other hand. And then when he got to his house, he would sprawl in the front parlor, and he would open up the latest installment of Edgar Rice Burroughs' series of adventures of John Carter on Mars. And these stories of a fanciful Mars caught the imagination of the young Ray Bradbury so profoundly, so powerfully, that he literally went outside on a summer night in Waukegan and looked up in the sky where Mars was a glowing orange dot and wished to the powers that be, "Mars, take me home." So Ray was one of the early Martians who walked among us. And thank God he never got to go to Mars and leave us, because he's been here all this time, inspiring and really giving us, I think of him as my mentor, even though I only met him once for a very brief time when I was a college student working at the Jet Propulsion Lab. And Ray is, to me, the poet laureate of space exploration. And I'm just forever in his debt. And we'll talk a little bit more about him as the evening goes on. Let me tell you a little bit about how this book came to be. I began working on this book at the beginning of 2004, which happened to be the time when 2 new Mars explorers arrived on Mars. And you see a representation of those Mars explorers there on the left. It's not a photograph because there was nobody on Mars to photograph them. They were robots. They are robots. The Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. In the course of writing this book, what I have tried to do is make not only the robots come alive and kind of put you on the surface of Mars with them, but even more important, and you see in the center picture there, the people who have made these explorations happen. They have been the driving force behind Mars exploration. And the fellow there with his arms raised in triumph is a geologist and planetary scientist named Stephen Squires of Cornell University. And as I found out when I interviewed him, and I went out to JPL and spent about a week with the rover team and sat down with Steve and his colleagues, you know, that moment when he knew that the rover Spirit had arrived safely on Mars was not just the moment of triumph for that particular mission, but it was really, in a sense, the end of a multi-decade quest in Steve's life, because he had spent 10 years applying to NASA to be a scientist on a Mars mission without being accepted. And he called it 10 years of crushing disappointments, one after the other, to the point where he really wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. Thankfully, he did keep going, and he was responsible for the scientific instruments that turned those two robots into field geologists, robotic field geologists on the surface of Mars. Truly an extension of the intellect and the passion of Steve Squires and his teammates. But I think that would have been enough for me to spend 4 years, as it was 4 years, writing this book. But it was even more compelling to me because it was also an intensely personal story. And I go back to when I was 5 years old in 1961, and one of the books I had on my shelf was a book called You Will Go to the Moon. And I suspect that was on quite a few bookshelves of future Mars explorers. And it's a really amazing little book. It's about a young boy who, through some unexplained parental connections or I don't know what, gets to go along on a moon flight. So here's this young boy, and he's on the moon with the astronauts. And at the end of the book, he and one of the astronauts climb up to the top of a lunar hill, and they look up into the sky of the moon. Now they've gone all, you've seen them travel from the Earth in a giant rocket. You've seen them go up to a space station before they head to the moon. You've seen them land on the moon. You've seen them get into space suits and go bounding across the moon's surface in lunar gravity. And you know that they have taken the journey of a lifetime. But here they are at the end of the book, standing on this hill, and they are looking up in the sky, and there is a glowing red world, which is Mars. And that picture brings home something profound, which is that even when you have gone to the moon, you have barely left home. And Mars, the moon is only 250,000 miles away. Mars never comes closer than 35 million miles to the Earth. When people go to Mars, they will really have left home. And there I was as a 5-year-old in 1961, and I was ready to go to the moon for sure. But this also lit a spark in me of the enormous quest, the enormous challenges of exploring Mars and then one day getting there. Well, before the space age began, 1961 was the year that the first humans went into space, but this picture was taken the summer I was born, just a few months after I was born, 1956. It was taken with the 60-inch telescope at Mount Wilson in California by an astronomer named Robert Layton of Caltech. And this picture is probably the single best portrait of Mars that we had before the space age began. It's the best that we were able to do at that time. And yet, look at it. It is maddeningly vague. The best we could make out was a series of irregular dark markings superimposed on a very bright pinkish desert. And down at the bottom there you see one of the polar ice caps. At that time, you know, it really was a very difficult job to piece together enough information to say what Mars was really like. And out of that ambiguity came some amazing ideas, many of which were completely outside the realm of reality, but nevertheless made Mars a magnet for human imagination and curiosity. And we have to thank for that largely a Boston Brahmin named Percival Lowell. You see old Percy there on the left, and